the solar panels, and we need to study very hard how put this area. What is the model to put the surface and the figure? Yes, the optimization of area and the optimization to clean the solar panels, the ways between the solar panels.
Any other questions regarding this presentation? If that's the case, thank you once again.
Thank you very much.
So the next presentation is given by Ole Wiegen. He's a research assistant at Partner Institute, University of Potsdam. He is concerned with typical geodata, geometry data in form of point clouds taken by typical sensors and remote sensing systems.
If you want.
And he's going to present his ideas about how to have a kind of foundation for reflecting the built reality via a spatio-temporal data structure or based on point clouds. This is, of course, an ongoing project that but today we can present the first ideas and the concepts we are going to investigate further. And I hope streaming is now working. Andreas, you might want to check whether the streaming is working here, because for the next presentation as well, Marcus, we can have a virtual presentation. Yeah, it's working. Okay, so Ole, what's yours?
Thank you. The idea of the smart city has gained more and more popularity in recent years, and Professor William J. Mitchell from MIT states, and let me quote, "Cities are systems of systems, and there are emerging opportunities to introduce digital nervous systems, intelligent responsiveness, and optimization at every level of system integration, from that of individual devices and appliances to that of buildings, and ultimately to that of complete cities and urban regions." So the basic idea, according to Professor Mitchell, is to introduce digital nervous systems. This means some kind of data has to flow in order to enable optimization and responsiveness. Here you can see some of the more concrete use cases and applications that fall under the term of the smart city. These can be found in literature. So, for example, you see here infrastructure monitoring, transportation analysis and optimization, natural resource management, surveillance, and much more. In general, it can be said that all of these applications fall into one of three categories: real-time monitoring, optimization of processes, and intelligent responsiveness or control. Minoli et al. Identify 6 key areas for smart city applications, and these key areas are energy, water, mobility, buildings, vegetation, and government. So what we can see is there's really a wide variety of different applications and use cases that fall under this term, the smart city. Now, nevertheless, there's one technology that is perceived as a key technology for enabling smart city applications, and this is the so-called digital twin. So a digital twin is a virtual representation of real-world objects, and it is characterized by a tight data connection between the physical entity and the virtual representation. So data flows from the real world into the virtual entity to keep it updated, and data flows from the virtual entity into the real world to exercise some kind of control, to inform responsibles, to initiate processes. Now, digital twins have some properties, and Minerva and Crespi identify these properties. I want to mention or highlight 3 of them. Reflection, so a digital twin has to mirror the state of the real world, and therefore it has to be updated regularly. Memorization, a digital twin does not only reflect the current state, but also all past states, all historical states. and predictability. We want to use a digital twin for simulation. Now, in our work, we focus on the geometric side of the digital twin. So this is only one aspect. There are other aspects like the sensoric side, but we focus on representing geometric realities in a virtual manner. And now the question is, how can we construct such a digital twin? What is the base data that we have available, and how can we use it? And one answer to this question is the 3D point clouds. So 3D point clouds are a common artifact of as-is environment capturing using laser scanners, and therefore they are often used to construct and maintain digital twins. And here you can see an example of a point cloud of a city. Point clouds are a very flexible geometry representation. They comprise single points with attributes, position in space, of course, a color, maybe a semantic class. And as I said before, a digital twin should also reflect all historical states. So we do not speak about 3D point clouds, but about 4D point clouds, which is an extension of the 3D point cloud into the temporal domain. So we have point clouds, for example, for a building for several timestamps. Point clouds are faced by a number of challenges. So for starters, they have massive storage requirements, especially if we speak about city scale point clouds for multiple timestamps, so 4D point clouds. Additionally, they can be quite sparse and unevenly distributed, the points in the point cloud, which makes it difficult to compare multiple point clouds, and there are inconsistencies in point clouds. So if I scan the same building multiple times and nothing changes between these scans, the point clouds will differ nonetheless due to noise, inconsistencies, or errors in the reconstruction and in the acquisition process. Here you can see an overview of the data flow in the smart city. So we have the real world on top, comprising the more static built and natural environment, buildings, infrastructure, vegetation, and the more dynamic part, people. And we want to construct a digital twin representing this real world. And it's been updated using data that flows from the real world, using frequent environment scanning with the LiDAR devices. This data has to be integrated into some kind of spatial temporal database, which can then be used on the one hand for real-time monitoring to inform or alert responsibles, for example, if a fire breakout is detected. And the same database should be used for offline analysis by responsibles to support decision making. Now, this is really the core of our work. We outlined 9 requirements for such a data structure, which we derive from the challenges of digital twins and point clouds in the context of smart cities. And due to time limitations, I can't go into detail for each of these requirements, so I refer you to our paper if you're interested. But I want to highlight some of these. So first of all, we need some kind of compact memory representation. The base data that we have available for the point clouds are quite memory intensive. We want to store past and current states across the whole city. So we have to reduce these massive storage requirements somehow. And one idea could be to eliminate the temporal redundancy in the point clouds. And I will elaborate on this in a bit. Another requirement is, we speak about city scale data. So we have to support high spatial scale in this data structure. And at the same time, we want to use this data for analysis. So we need sufficient detail in the data for this. This probably requires out-of-core streaming approaches, and it stands in contrast to the first requirement, to the compact memory representation. And we can see this in all these requirements. There are always conflicting requirements. So we have to find a good trade-off between these. Now, as we have seen in the beginning, there's a wide variety of different applications that is subsumed under this term of the smart city, and these different applications have different resolution requirements. So for example, there could be an application that is responsible for monitoring the streets to detect damage on the street, like cracks, for example. Then we would need a very high spatial resolution of our geometric data because we want to detect single cracks. But the temporal resolution maybe does not have to be that high because we only want to know right now where are cracks in the street. Another application maybe monitors the vegetation growth over time. So we need a more or a higher temporal resolution we monitor over time, but the spatial resolution does not have to be that high because we want to distinguish between single trees, but not between single leaves on the trees. So there are very different resolution requirements, and we do not want to construct a digital twin for each of these applications, but we want one digital twin that can be used by all of these use cases or applications. So these different temporal and spatial resolutions have to be considered when building a data structure. And let me quote Van et al., the spatial and temporal resolution of the digital twin should be informed by the purpose it serves. Additionally, a city is a hierarchical system. We have the city, it comprises districts, these comprise buildings, these comprise floors, and so on. And a data structure should reflect this hierarchical nature also to facilitate a variety of use cases. Finally, let me mention semantic information. So semantic information is very useful for separating relevant objects from irrelevant objects in a scene, dependent on the concrete use case. And if a data structure could integrate semantic information, this would also facilitate the use of this same data structure or the same digital twin for a variety of use cases, and therefore would be very useful. Now, these are the requirements that we outlined, and now I want to propose a first concept for a data structure. And the base idea is to eliminate the temporal redundancy in the point clouds, because if we scan a building multiple times, probably not everything has changed. Small things may have changed, but we do not want to store the whole raw point cloud every time. So we eliminate the temporal redundancy using incremental storage approach. We store one base geometry, an initial scan maybe, and in subsequent timestamps, we only store the changes made to this base geometry. Now, the problem with point clouds is that computing changes between point clouds is not a trivial task. And there is an ongoing field of research. It's possible, of course, but it's not trivial. And there is the view in literature that 4D point clouds are probably not the most efficient way to store this spatial temporal data. They are easy to acquire. They are very good as base data or acquisition artifact, but for storage, maybe not the most efficient way. So we propose to use another geometry representation for storing this data, namely signed distance functions. So a signed distance function returns for every point in space the distance to the nearest surface, and therefore implicitly defines geometry. You can see an example down here of a two-dimensional signed distance function in a discretized manner. So we have a grid. Each grid stores the distance to the surface, and in 3D it's the same. We have a three-dimensional voxel grid storing these distance values. Such signed distance fields can be reconstructed from point clouds or from RGBD image data, and they have very useful properties. For example, they can be subtracted from each other, and this enables an incremental storage approach. Now, storing a full three-dimensional voxel grid is also very memory inefficient, so we need some way to make it sparse. Not every voxel contains necessary or useful information. And actually, Niesner et al. Proposed such a data structure for storing sparse signed distance fields in 2013 already. They developed it for GPU-based reconstruction from image data. And they use hash tables for access of the underlying voxel data, which ensures fast access and therefore real-time integration of new data. And at the same time, these hash tables can be blocked and streamed in and out. So they provide an out-of-core approach, which is useful for scalability in the spatial domain. It's a very interesting paper. I would recommend that you read it sometime. And here you can see an example of a 3D reconstruction from image data with their approach. So what would be the advantages of using such a signed distance field approach over just raw point clouds? Well, first of all, of course, they reduce memory requirements due to the incremental storage. Then another useful property of signed distance fields is their regular nature, and this facilitates compression. Actually, there are compression methods for meshes that use signed distance fields as an intermediate representation because they can be compressed much better. Then, using this sparse voxel data structure from Niesner et al., we can support high spatial scale and sufficient detail, and also fast access due to this hash table-based approach. Signed distance fields can be converted to point clouds, which ensures interoperability with existing point cloud analysis approaches. And sight distance fields can be decomposed into different frequencies or different levels of granularity. And this ensures the use for different resolution requirements, as I explained earlier. Here you can see an abstract overview. So in the temporal domain, we store the base geometry and changes to the space geometry. In the spatial domain, we store a sparse voxel field using hash tables, and this voxel is also decomposed into different levels, detail or different granularity levels. And then we have to provide an interface for data access, integration of new data, compression, and so on. So let me summarize. The digital twin is one of the key technologies for enabling smart city applications. Now, in our work, we outline the boundary conditions, the requirements, the challenges for a spatial temporal data structure in this context. And we perceive that 4D point clouds are commonly used for acquisition, but they come with very high storage requirements and other deficiencies regarding level of detail, for example. So we propose to use a signed distance field as base geometry for storing this spatial temporal data, and an incremental storage scheme to exploit temporal redundancy. So this proposed data structure is to be understood as a first proposal, a conceptual step towards developing such a base data structure for smart cities that can be used for a wide variety of applications in this context. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me now.
Any questions for Ole?
Yeah, sir.
I just wondered if I got it right. Design distance field, is it introducing any loss at the precision of the data, like you would have a regression line?
You mean if you convert the raw data, the point cloud or the RGBD images into a signed distance field?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course, there probably will be some loss. So if you want to convert a point cloud into a signed distance field, you can use jump flooding. And if the point cloud is very dense, but you choose the voxel size very high, you of course lose precision. So you have to very carefully choose the size of the single voxels in your voxel field to ensure that you do not lose that much precision. But I think, so in practice, this shouldn't be a problem. And if you use RGBD image data as base data, you do not lose any precision at all, at least not more than you would lose if you convert it to a point cloud. Yeah.
It's possible to found temporal relations to reduce the 4-dimension time and geometry to 3-dimension curve differential geometry.
Sorry again?
A curve differential geometry, a curve with 3 coordinates depend of the time.
Yeah.
It's possible to reduce some time, or you have seen a model, a regular model in this coordinate. Is totally sample random.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you have multiple scans of the same building and there are parts that do not change, and you construct a signed distance field for each of the scans, then you have parts that are the same, obviously, or nearly the same. And if you subtract these signed distance fields, you get also a signed distance field that represents the change between these two. So if you then only store the changes, which has less occupied voxels than the whole scan, you reduce this temporal redundancy, and yes, do not need that much storage.
Any further questions?
Or is there any prerequisite for like what data can go into design distance field? That's why
Okay, yeah, I mean, probably you want to use some kind of geometric data. A signed distance field is a surface representation. So, yeah.
So it wouldn't matter how much dimension.
Oh, good question. So I only work with 3-dimensional or 4-dimensional signed distance fields. Probably it wouldn't matter. But I only know of cases where geometric data is converted into signed distance fields like meshes, point clouds, or occupancy grids, whatever. But I know you work with non-geometric data. I don't know. You have to try it out.
Yeah, thank you again, Ole, for your presentation.
Thank you.
And now we are moving on to the third talk of this session, which is given by Markus Jobs from Austria. And I guess we will have him on the screen in a few seconds. Yeah, he's talking about a conscious data space from a data provider perspective, and I'm sure Markus will explain why he has this perspective. Is he online? Is he?
Yes, I am online, and I hope you can hear me.
Hello, Markus, and we can see you and we can hear you.
Wonderful.
Maybe
So,
louder.
thank you for this invitation.
It's okay. Yeah.
And the possibility for virtual participation. Maybe I've quite provocative title, heading to a common conscious data space in terms of extending a smart environment, extending a smart data space. And I will give this insight from a data provider perspective. So I'm involved in the INSPIRE implementation and the Open Data Directive implementation in a national mapping cadastral agency. And I'm also involved at the UN level, which means it's a quite high level view and not the direct programming view. And therefore I ask for a bit of understanding for this high level view. But with my colleague, who is an academic in regional planning, we have done a quite pragmatic example. So today's data products and the portfolio of national mapping and cadastral agencies and the statistical agencies is a quite manifold portfolio. And we have seen point clouds in the previous talk, which is a very specific data set. And deriving from point clouds, we can go into classifications, we can go into analysis. But of course, there are a lot of different data involved when you're a national provider and you have the main task of providing this information in a reliant and sustainable way. So we understand ourselves as fundament. Our data are the fundament of a modern society where we are providing these sustainable and reliant data lakes. And we have done an example in the Alps with several municipalities, which was a project of my colleague Tatjana Fischer, who is co-authoring this paper. And this will help us to understand the perspective that we are provoking in this paper. So the agenda I will propose is that I will, for some extent, explain what we expect of a common conscious data space. So what is our imagery of a common conscious data space? I will then go into what we do at the moment, what we define as spatial data lake or smart environment for data information, what can we observe at the moment. And the third part will go into the pragmatic requirements and perspectives, what we have observed by our example. So speaking of a common conscious data space means that we are extending our view of smart environment, of the information that is around, and we are extending the meaning and the collection of microservices and data sources by a network of secure and self-determined exchange of maintained information. So any information that is in there could be used with a secure and self-determined exchange. It does not matter if this information is coming from a known or unknown partner. is a data lake. So it is really a collection and not a priori known what is in there. Which also means that if you establish a data lake like this, you have an agreed level of trust among all participating parties. So anyone who is participating in this data lake will have to provide a specific level of trust. And if you do it like this, then we expect that this common conscious data space is bridging a variety of use cases and thematic domains. So it's not a thematic focused data set, but it's really a data lake of several use cases. A very important aspect here is that we keep up data sovereignty. And this is done by establishing core competencies and responsibilities and the maintenance of the data in the backend. So the conscious data space is extending a smart environment. It also means that it is also using the characteristics of the smart environment. So we are speaking of a smart information environment, in fact, where all the digital components are mutually interactive. There's a continuous recording, analyzing, processing of this information in this data lake or data space. And it is dynamically creating new measures, new procedures that are then again used in our procedures and analysis. This calls for very high reliability of the data, of the relations, and will also come up with the requirement of a fault-tolerant relation, which means that we have redundant relations in there. It is not enough to have one relation to a semantic definition, but you have several existing ones. From the geospatial perspective, we have to add further requirements. I'm not going into detail for the quality constraints here, accuracy, actuality, completeness, consistency. But the impact on functional space of regional planning is enormous because the geospatial aspect is delivering something like the influence of topographic structures, which means if you have a connection between two cities and the shortest connection is going across a mountain, it is not a valid connection then. You have to take the road, of course. And this is what partly is done at the moment and what we need to break up. Furthermore, we need to have a historicized understanding of space. So the semantic structures are changing continuously. And we need to understand or to store and to make the historicized development available. At least these requirements are creating a comprehensive spatial long-term memory, which is used for the urban and regional data management, geoinformation management, and analysis. So what is the actual status of a common spatial data space? What are we doing at the moment? And maybe some of you have seen those pictures already. So at the European level, we are working for a common European data space, where at the beginning we were speaking of one common data space. We are now splitting up to thematic domains. But the intention is that the information that is in this data space can be exchanged. There is no definition about historization. There's no definition about the quality that's embedded, so the scale level. But the requirement is that we have a network of nodes providing us with this different kind of data. In addition to this common European data space, we are heading towards location intelligence. So this is also the Digital Europe program that the European Commission is at the moment running and where we are heading towards. So we, as National Mapping Cadastral Agency, we are also following this pathway. And I'm sure that this is a right one. In the end, as spatial scientists, I'm sure that we are heading towards the spatial knowledge infrastructure, which is a synonym for a conscious common data space. We are doing it at the moment in a way that we are linking the meaning of metadata, at least metadata. There's some information around where we are connecting the meaning of data sets and features across data spaces. So this is a very known example, the LOD cloud, the linked open data cloud. And what is highlighted here with the green relations is the geographical names. And you will see that geographical names are used in a very variety of different domains here. Now, we could think that we have a data lake and we can easily extract our information and take it as it is and go directly into the analysis. But this is not true. If you have a look into the processes of data lakes at the moment, then we have different stages here. We need to collect something. We need to ingest this big data. We need to blend it to our requirements and needs. And then we transform it for our analysis and publication in order to redistribute. So these are several steps, and we are not removing the processes of the data lake just by harmonizing our data sets. We have spoken of different information, and as spatial scientists, then we are thinking, what is the important information that we need? At the UN level, we have defined the fundamental spatial data themes. So these are data themes that could help to answer a lot of questions of the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. So this is the information that we need very, very often in a variety of domains. So as data provider, it's now easy. I would say half of these fundamental data themes I can provide. I'm offering this. But is this enough? And I can tell you, no, this is not enough, because the understanding of transport network is very detailed. Because the transport network is containing of the road, of the water, of the rail, and a lot of other aspects where you can derive information of. So it's not enough to provide a data theme containing just the bus stops. This will not create any relation. The same for water. You have rivers, you have the sea, you have the groundwater. You could go for the water quality. Just providing, for example, a data set of wave height for the sensors is not enough to cover the whole theme of water. So you see, it's very inhomogeneous. It's very differentiated what we are dealing with here. And please don't forget the last aspect, the citizen science, which is very, very important. I'm coming from an authoritative, slow environment, slow framework. But citizen science is quite fast, quite important, because it's the user perspective coming in, and also the collective intelligence. For example, if you go by car, and a lot of people using Android phones, you have the traffic situation type transportable. So how could we now break the silos for a common conscious data space? What could be the steps that we think out of the box and remove those thematic themes? We have learned from Inspire that harmonization is not enough. So we have done harmonization for the last 12 years. And this is not leading us to a working infrastructure. What we need is a common understanding of the content. What is it? Which means that we need stakeholder registries. We need a core vocabulary, and maybe also foundational ontology. And this is what we have tried in our example. And this is in an abstracted level how we work for these different data themes. So we have the storage at the bottom, where we have the schemas, how we store our information. But then we need to transport this content. That's the way we talk. That's the vocabularies that we have defined on our knowledge, on our storage. In the end, we have on this level of vocabularies different ways of thinking. The taxonomy, the usage of the vocabularies is different from each different domain. So you have not only one ontology, but you have several ontologies, at least for every domain that we are observing. Which means we have another core requirement here, which is a foundational topographic ontology. So from our point of view, maps and the spatial domain is offering a semantic structure of the topographic content, which establishes a universal foundational ontology. It can be used to bring the meaning into those information and data. And we have done this for centuries already, where we are classifying at different scale levels, and you see it in those legends of the maps, for example. But now the question is, if this information is collected, it's not always the same, it's changing. And how could we observe it? How could we create an observable, discrete space of this information? So discretizing space in order to steer and observe geometric changes of the geographical features is the approach that we're heading to. And we need to encapsulate the semantics. Does the road change? Is it going to be a highway or still a residential road? So we have core requirements here in order to identify those information change, which is the georeferencing. And we are doing this with geographical grids, which means that we have data integration involved and persistent identifiers embedded. Otherwise, we cannot establish the relations. And then, of course, we're connecting those grids with the spatial semantics. Bringing the spatial semantics into the grids is done, for example, in regional statistical grids. And we have done this in statistics for a large extent. And the reason is that we can compare the content in their change during time, for example. So now we are adding this level of discretization to our model, and we are putting it on the top of the foundational topography, where we have the discretized space in order to be comparable through time. So we have done this in our example for a lot of municipalities, and we have observed that the quality inhomogeneities, for example, could be mapped to the different grids that we have had in use. So in this case, specific information has been mapped to 250-meter grid, whereas in the next screenshot, we are mapping the information to a 100-meter grid. Again, this information is comparable because the 200-meter and the 100-meter grids are part of each other. And the steps that we have used in the backend, because I have told you that we are embedding semantics, and this is just a screenshot of a specific question in here, is embedding a graph in the backend. So we will call it a geospatial grid graph approach. This term is not discussed, I have to say. It's just the first try to establish our requirements and fulfill our requirements. And with this establishing of the grid for the information container and the graph on the same hand for the semantic structuring, we could easily ask the system a lot of questions now. There are some disadvantages if we go for the grid graph approach or the grid approach. the grids are very specific in their definition. So this is the reason why we call it regional statistical grids, because they're only valid for a region and definition. If you have another grid definition, another geospatial or coordinate reference system embedded, then the grid does not match again. And there are a lot of grid definitions out there, because the regular grids, they're not covering the whole Earth. We have different specifications for the poles, so it's not usable for environmental global topics, for example. Therefore, we have a discrete global grid system, but this is a hexagonal grid, for example. So allow me to resume. From the viewpoint of spatial planning and a long-term view on space, we have the need for a common conscious data space. We do not know which information we need a priori, but we need access to a lot of information here. Actual frameworks and implementation of spatial databases do not cover semantic requirements at the moment. So we need the semantic add-on, the semantic grid, maybe in the backend. It's very pragmatic to introduce a statistical grid and combine it with graphs. And it was working for us. And it needs further investigation if it's really working for a wider audience and more use cases. But the main requirement here is that we have a common understanding of the content. So we need a persistent foundational ontology with common core vocabularies and a high degree of flexibility that allows us to go into this flexible system of semantics and fault-tolerant relations in this systematic. So I hope I could have taken you to this idea of a common conscious data space from our planning perspective and data provider perspective. And I'm open to questions. Thank you.
Okay, Markus, thank you very much for your presentation. I do have a first question. I like the expression data lake because I think it corresponds to reality. Apart from metadata, what role do you see for ontology, which is around yet for a long time, but still unclear why it is useful? Might it be useful for data lakes, or do you see the need for any further concepts that would help to organize, to structure a data lake?
Well, from my point of view and my experiences, the ontology, the semantic structuring is very important in the data lake. At the point when you start to access it. So maybe it's dependent on your use case. So it's quite flexible, the structuring. And as you know, if you ask graphs to deliver an answer, the graph is building up the relations, maybe in real time. And therefore, a priori ontology is not sufficient. Therefore, our approach was, at least for the spatial topics, the spatial and topographic content, to have a foundational ontology. So a common understanding what space means, what is a road, what is a river, and what is this, this fundamental data theme, so that we have an idea of what is this information in this data lake, what is this data about. Then we can go for a refinement. So ontologies are really core here, and we are a bit suffering or lacking these definitions in an authoritative sense. So our national mapping agencies at the moment do not know what an ontology is, although it has been around for several years.
Yeah, thank you. Any further questions for Markus? No more questions? So thank you once again, Marcus, for your talk. Yeah, and maybe see you here in the next days. Bye. So the final talk of this session is given by Andreas Fricke. He's research assistant. He's finalizing his PhD in these months. And well, you can try. If it's not working, okay. In a few minutes, in a few seconds, we will have his slides. Yeah, Andreas in general is concerned, or his research is concerned with creating virtual 3D models of the environment, of cities, of landscapes. And he reports on a very specific large project that has as a focus point the creation of a virtual 3D city model. Andreas, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. So if I saw the other talks, I put the content into a broader image because the different parts of the other talks are part of my process, of our process in our project, because we started with the data and ended with the visualization. So we kind of wrap up of all the other talks, and in some parts we see that. So if we think about urban planning and design is kind of particular because in this area of East Jerusalem where we have the project, it's kind of very specific and very difficult to plan the urban areas, to plan the urban cityscape because of the controversial cityscapes structure, because of the Israeli version, because of the Palestinian version, and we are into this kind of reality there. And if we're talking about planning, then we are also talking about not the present day reality, we are talking about the next future and the next development and the next phase of urban cityscaping, let's say, to shape the future in the next reality. So for our project, the prerequisites were that we have a very broad space-related data set in terms of geotopographic base data, so the bottom line, the base data for any specific application, or for specific use cases, for example, different sectors for health or for waste, water management, and so on. So a broad data stock or data lake, if we be in this picture, and we all need this to shape the geospatial reality, kind of the digital twin in the future. So as a consequence, I mentioned this, we need the data, and if we do not have the data, what's then to do? And in our project, Jürgen mentioned this was a R&D funded project by the European Union for almost 4 years, and the idea was to map the status quo of East Jerusalem. So that was the task. We had partners in Palestine, we had partners from different NGOs in Europe, and that was what we did there. So the point of reference, or the starting point, was that the initial situation was we do not have the data. There was no data. The Israelis had the data, but they are not open, and we cannot use them for building our virtual city model. So we decided to build our own data stock, and that's what I mentioned. We start within this process at the very beginning with data acquisition and with the visualization part. And the application domain, as I mentioned, is that we use this data stock, this data collection, to build a virtual 3D city model for the entire area of East Jerusalem. You will see that in the pictures later, roughly 190 square kilometers, so a larger area. the area of East Jerusalem is representing the city type of an oriental city, and therefore it's also quite difficult to map this kind of city. You might know, for instance, the old city of Jerusalem. You might know Damascus in Syria or Tehran in Iran. These cities are interwoven. The structure is not clear. So the question was, what kind of data do you need in the beginning to map these structures? And that's the point where the point cloud comes in. So we decided we have this initial situation, the real world. This is the temple dome, and we have this famous digital twin, and of course we have a digital model on the other side. And the digital model is that what you need for applications, for answering specific applications. For example, in this case, the status or the function of a building. So the coloring on the right of these buildings is representing, for instance, function of a building. That is the semantic content, which was what Ole also was mentioning. And in between, there's somewhere this digital twin. It's kind of an enriched semantic model represented by reality-like geometries. But in the end, behind all these stuff is definitely a model because of abstraction reality. The digital twin is just the ideal state at the end, but for any applications, it's a model behind this. So that's the point, the objectives of this project. I will go just briefly. I talked about this. So we started with data. We did an acquisition of a point cloud. We used therefore a flight campaign. Luckily, we got the permission of a flight campaign over East Jerusalem. We processed the stereo images in terms of result of a point cloud, and we did with our partners there further surveys, household surveys in the area. So we collected the semantic content. We had the geometry from the point clouds. We had the semantics from the household surveys, which combined this. So Fusion built a huge data stock, data lake, whatever you would call it. And this is the first part, and the second part is how to utilize this data. So you need a process in terms of visualization of 3D, 2D data, and so on. And you have all these different actors, authorities in terms of state administration or the civil society in the end, and all should use this kind of data stock and utilize it. So I cannot go into detail, but a few of these process steps you might know. So data, database, processing, destination, and all here are the segments, the modules of our process, which have been generic, which have been could be interchanged, and so on. The next phase and the next image is a little bit better because now it's the application of this. So we have data sets, for example, for instance, point clouds, the geotopographic base data. We have the household surveys, and what we can see here is kind of the larger modules components. So somehow data integration, harmonization. The database, we built our own data model for this. We do not use the city GML because we were thinking an object, for instance, a house, is needed, and you should track and trace it to the from the present into the past and also into the future. That's why we built our own data model. And for example, here on the right side, here's the visualization system connected to the database utilizing the data. Here's kind of a server who is serving the data through web APIs, for instance, for other geographic information systems, visualization systems, or other services. So it's kind of flexible system based on different complements, which can be interchanged. So images. What we did, as I mentioned, we built our own point cloud. So 190 square kilometers was the study area, and in the result we have stereo images. For example, here is the old city of Jerusalem. That's the left image, that's the right image, different RGB eye channels, so with the infrared information that you can detect vegetation, for instance. We built our blog, and the result was that it's quite accurate. So our resulting point cloud had a resolution, you can see that here, of about 9 centimeter ground sampling distance. And that means that typically the point clouds, if you look from nadir, from above, that's shown here, these are different point clouds. So on the left, it's a sparse cloud, that one. And on the right, it's the enriched cloud we processed, that's that image. So this is the same dimension extent of the area. So we were able to even derive the facade, so very clear mapping of the status quo. And for sure, cannot imagine if you can see that here, but it's quite accurate, you have to trust me. And of course, a 3D mesh for representing the reality in kind of photorealistic, in a photorealistic way. Okay, so what we did, we had the point cloud. We did several computational processes. We thinned it a bit, we voxelized it, and then afterwards we were looking for the building footprint as a reference point, and then use this building footprint to extrude and reconstruct the building upon it. If you have different structures, maybe you can see that there are different heights of the building, so we use building blocks and put them together in the afterwards and use them. What you can see here is the thematic enrichment. So afterwards, we had the geometric part, we had the household survey part, and we combined this in our database. And we also used, Marcus will see that, we also used the grid system because we were in a complex geopolitical situation, and boundaries and administrative boundaries are a sensitive topic. So we choose grid cells to kind of anonymize, but also utilize the data in a more generic way for transferability and so on. So, for example, this is maybe you can see that these white shapes in the back are actually the houses. It's kind of as wide as high in the first dimension is the house. And what we did is we calculated, for instance, a population density calculation here. And for instance, this house here is quite high, and our approach showed and qualifies that in this house many people are living. And for instance, these grid cells here are 25 meters, and that's quite enough to map the status quo of East Jerusalem, because kind of calculations in this area, for instance, in the population density, population general topic, have never been done before, because the data was not present. That's the thing. And for instance, you can also clearly see that the street here, that's a street, is not used by the grid. So that's the case. And afterwards, we had our geometric part of the city. We have enriched the thematics from, for instance, the household surveys from different sectors, as I mentioned, health or population or income or whatever you can think of, or the function as shown here. And we utilize this with the cesium-based framework for visualizing the 3D component of it, and enriched it with some functionality, and get in the result this kind of model for the first time ever. That's the important thing to mention. And I also talked about planning in the beginning, and what we see here is kind of an example scenario that you get an idea what this virtual model for decision making means in the end. And you will see also that it's titled 3D city model, but what I want to give you, what I want to mention here is that 3D is not in any case the best way to utilize the data or to utilize it for planning purposes. What we see here is a 2D map and a 3D map of part of the study area, showing where actually school locations are, different colors, different types of schools, and how accessible they are in terms of transport network. It's the bus network with these reddish lines, and in the back the population density, for instance, and the houses in 2D and in 3D. And I guess you would rather agree that the left one is better to understand than the right one, because the message is communicating better on the left than on the right. And that's what I want to see. Want to give you on the way that 3D models are nice to have, but it depends on the application. If it's useful or more useful than the old school version with 2D maps in the end, and that's what I want to say here. And now I would conclude. I know that it's hard to wrap up a 4 years project of us in just 20 minutes or even 15 minutes. If you have any questions, just get in contact with me. But what we did, we had the data stock. We started with the data, with the real data processing, with the requirements of the data. We built our data stock, our database. We utilized this, and we were also thinking about effective and efficient visualization techniques in the end to communicate the message, because it's about communication if you deal with these geospatial scenarios, and even in the situation of East Jerusalem. That's what's count in the end, the communication of the situation, because the situation was never mapped so accurate before, and that's the reason why this is a good project in the end. So thank you very much.
Any questions for Andreas?
Just curious if this project you're doing, or if you have any way to map building properties specifically in building energy model, things like spatial fenestration.
I mean, what we built here is the let's call it cadastral light of the entire area, and with our 3D, with our very accurate 3D representation of, for instance, the building objects, we could utilize this for further applications, for energy supplying or for solar plants or whatever. In our project, we included, for instance, the waste and water services as a topic, as an application scenario. But it is just a starting point. So we did the reference. The reference is now there, and the reference should be utilized for further applications. In any case, 2D, 3D, whatever it depends.
Is there any, like in most European countries, you have Pyramidal, which gives building properties for buildings or building architects. Is there any work in Jerusalem that you could draw and you add the model that you're aware of?
Yes and no. The thing with the situation in East Jerusalem is that how to say that in easy words and diplomatic words. It's quite sensitive, and we did in May our final presentation in Jerusalem for the donor, European Commission, European Union, and for instance for the Jerusalem municipality. And they were very happy and enlightened that we did this work, because now they have kind of a reference, as I mentioned, for any further planning, for any further idea of planning. Because if you just have the fantasy and the idea of doing something, but have no starting point, no reference set how far you can go or how feasible the field might be, because these models are also used for simulation. As I mentioned in the beginning, for the future, it's not just the status quo. I mean, the status quo is mapped now, but it's the reference for the future. They were very happy to have this reference, for instance. I hope I answered this question a bit.
Can I answer?
Yeah, maybe.
It is about accessing the data, for instance, of the kind that we were talking about. And many of these data are available. They're totally available. So we didn't particularly look for those data that you were mentioning. But I would guess that you can access some of those data. And then you use 3D data to visualize the potential for its or solar or whatever. And another problem is how reliable data that are available. Some are, for instance, from the municipality, which is the area administration. Others are available from international organizations, and so on and so forth. So apart from the question, are data available, you also basically the question of data that you have to assess, because Andrea mentioned we did a very high resolution data model, and you have to find a chip for those. So basically, it's a high resolution model that you have to take. Okay.
Yeah. So thank you very much again, Andreas. This also concludes our session. Let me summarize a little bit. There's only 1 minute. The growing amounts of data require more specialized data structures, such as a four-dimensional one, as Oleg presented. The growing amount of data and the growing complexity requires new and better and more automated processes. Andreas was showing us such a complex process model that leads to a certain representation of digital twins. Markus Jobst showed us a little bit challenges from a more abstract and higher level of abstraction, for example, the data lake concept. And Salvador showed us a new type of project driven by the demands of our society that will even produce more and more specific data that has to be integrated in what we in the future might call nervous system or conscious smart intelligence city and environment. Yeah, this was, I think, a good insight into ongoing projects. I thank you very much for being here. And yeah, I wish you a good conference, and yeah, see you soon. Thank you. Yes. Los datos que van a venir.
Only one question. This is the button.
So once you generate this spike train, the other important characteristics here that you will see on in the results section is effectively what is known interspike interval, ISI. And using this interspike interval, also the key characteristics here is so-called coefficient of variation, because it characterizes or provides information for you for simulating activity in a neuron. So if you like, it kind of helps you with the feedback mechanism and also assist you in a possible control. And therefore, for example, because as I said, it's a part of larger project in terms of the neurodegenerative diseases. For example, if you're talking about Alzheimer's disease, it provides you a certain level of control how to do that at the earlier stage. Now, a few numerical results that you will see here. So basically, to start with, you will see basically the results with respect to a neuron, and of course, at the dendrite sort of core. As you know, dendrite is kind of branch or collection of branch processes that emanate from the cell of a neuron and provides also these impulses, which could include in our study random impulses as well. So implementation is in Python here, and you know, the specific example that you will see for excitatory, it's basically 80 spikes, and for inhibitory, it's 20 spikes that would be seen on this slide. So Gaussian noise at the top level picture, and then you will see time evolution of this of membrane potential. And first few slides, you will see results with respect to additive noise. So the middle figure is with respect to additive noise current and random refractory period as well, as I mentioned before. Whereas bottom line is effectively kind of direct input current and direct refractory period. So there is a characteristic here which is quite important again in the area of neurodegenerative diseases is effectively burst notion. And here the definition of burst means that effectively neuron spikes more than once within 25 milliseconds. And that's effectively what you see for the random case, but you couldn't see that for the direct situation. You know, it's inspired to move on to look a little bit deeper and the situation in the next slide, as you see here, it's input-output transfer function for the neuron for the situation that I described. Again, in solid line here, you see the direct situation, and in a dashed line, sorry, the other way around. In the dashed line, you see DC input, and in the solid line, you see effectively the input that accounts for this additive noise. And the average injected current intervals, there are two actually for the random case, where the spike currents, the spike counts is the same in both situations. So the next thing that I would like to show you, of course, like now I mentioned this interspiking interval, which is extremely important here, and probably the easiest way like to visualize them is to using this histograms, because it's effectively the spike count distributions of a neuron situation that I just described. Again, you may recall that the key characteristics here is coefficient of variation, and what we observe here that this coefficient of variation is increases with increased value of these characteristics of the random refractory period that we introduce. And the spike also distributed here almost entirely within this interspiking interval for specific time. All right. And one more thing related to additive noise here is spike irregularity profile, because this is another characteristic that is quite important. So various situations here have been considered just to play with and to understand basically what these spike irregularity profiles may lead to. And effectively, one of the conclusions you could make that spike trains are substantially more regular with a range of this coefficient of variation between 0 and 0.5. more irregular when this coefficient of variation is greater than half. And therefore, in the conclusion, basically, the intermediate conclusion you could already draw from here is that in some cases, the presence of random input current, these oscillations could lead to burst discharges, which is important observation. Now, from here, we move effectively to multiplicative case, noise case, because it is more realistic case, right? Because noise could depend on the situation of on the current situation of the system. Again, the layout here is pretty much the same. So you see on the top figure white noise and then time evolution of membrane potential, this multiplicative noise and random refractory period. And the last row, it's effectively the evolution of membrane potential with the direct input current and refractory period. And this line, by the way, here is represented the spike threshold. You may recall that leaky fire and integrate model contains threshold that you have to set up. And here characteristics basically are given. So threshold potential is like this. This is, if you like, the first thing related to multiplicative noise, but then you increase the leaky conductance. The units here is nanosiemens. As you see, again, the layout of plots here are pretty similar to what you've seen before. The medium, it corresponds to stochastic case, and the dashed line represents the spike threshold. And what we observe here, so when we increase the leak conductance from the previous value on the previous slide to this value, the burst discharges are dramatically reduced in the case of multiplicative noise. So it's, again, another important observation to bear in mind. Now, if you look at input-output transfer functions, just visually, you would see the trend is pretty much the same in both cases, deterministic and stochastic. However, it is drastically different from additive noise situation. So that's, take out from this figure. So the spiking activity of neuron drastically reduces in the presence of multiplicative noise in the system, which is a set, which is, in our opinion, everyone has to consider this type of situation because this is the most realistic. Again, visually, this interspiking interval histogram gives you some idea in terms of distribution and spike irregularity values when they increase for specific intervals and so on and so forth. Now, this is the final figure in terms of multiplicative noise. What is presented here is actually spike irregularity profiles. And what you observe here is that spike irregularity coefficients of variation increases with the increase of value, stochastic value in terms of refractory period, which is similar to the case of additive noise situation in this particular case. But what you could also conclude that the larger injected currents are, the higher the value of this coefficient of variation. Now, after that, as on my first slide, you may recall that what we presented the fact of the characteristic of different type of plasticity, how we view that. And now the next step is how to integrate the short-term synaptic plasticity within the model that I just been discussing. So effectively, what you've seen before, if you may recall this spiking neural network algorithm that I presented at one of the first slides, the weights in the second step of the algorithm were fixed. Now what we are doing, we effectively allow vary those weights for the input as well, which could be mimicked in terms of the input conditions. And here, just again, a reminder what I already said, that the short-term plasticity is a phenomenon in which synaptic efficiency changes over time in a way that reflects the history of presynaptic activity. And there are two types, short-term depression and short-term facilitation. You will see at least one of them, the result. So basically, that's a type of or component of the model which you would integrate in that leaf, integrate, and fire model. Here, effectively, R here, if you like, typically denote resources available in the system for that, and GE calculated for effectively spike counts, delta direct function, Dirac function, and what else? And pretty similar model. What you see here, I remember that in the sub indices here is E, meaning that this is written for excitatory situation, but inhibitory situation is modeled in pretty similar way. You kind of take that model, incorporate this part in terms of short-term synaptic plasticity here, and you sort of view that through the Langevin framework, and then you do modeling, which I'm going to show a few things here. Of course, as some of you probably know, that pyramidal neurons here is a natural choice, especially if you take them at the dendrite level, is a natural choice for the analysis here, and that's effectively what we need. Other characteristics, different from the previous situation and been inspired by the literature, because these parameters have been used, for example, for dynamic clamping experiments, and we use these parameters for the validation of the original model. So what is presented here, again, in the same layout as you've seen before, so noise situation, then time evolution on the brain potential is random, and the last is direct input. It is quite clear that the memory can be reactivated under the weak excitatory input to this leaf or leak integrate and fire conductance system for this specific situation, as you see. And the presence of noise in the system increases the distance between each spike and decreases the spike in activity, therefore, of the neuron, compared to the case of the situation where we don't account for this random input. Now, the next slide is for different value of timing characteristics here, which effectively highlighted here. So it increased this, if you like, time delay in the system. What we can observe is that in the last row, which is related to non-stochastic situation, almost all spikes reach their threshold after the specific time. Whereas in the stochastic situation, the presence of random input current in the system leads to the increase in the distance between spike. And as you know, if the distance between spikes is increased, it effectively indicates that spiking activity in the system is decreases. So that's basically what I would like to present today. So let me give you a few conclusions that I would like to make now. So what we propose analysis of this leaky integrate and fire synaptic conductance with different type of noise, additive and multiplicative noise. The second situation is most realistic situation that hadn't been considered before. And using this description, we used Langevin's stochastic dynamics framework, and we also incorporated in this leak integrate and fire model this short-term synaptic plasticity and analyze effect of noise in a cell membrane potential. Not only additive and multiplicative noise, but you recall that refractory random period also has been incorporated in this system. And what you see in terms of numerical result in a few words here is the random input strongly affects the spike in activity in neuronic system or with respect to the specific model, Leaf's synaptic conductance model. And more than that, we observe the presence of multiplicative noise specifically versus burst discharges in this synaptic conductance dynamics. However, the increase in the value of the leak conductance, the bursting modes are reduced. And finally, when the values of average injected current are large, or sufficiently large, more precisely, together with increased standard deviation of refractory period, the regularity of spike trains increases. And that's what I've been talking about, these two characteristics, spiking interval and coefficient of variation. So what do you do from here? Well, there are a few things. Of course, this is, if you like, initial a starting point, and as I said, it's kind of our side project with respect to larger project for neurodegenerative diseases. However, I've been mainly talking about this spiking neural network. A pretty similar analysis could be done with respect to artificial neural network, of course, computationally much more intensive. And what is clear that understanding of these uncertainty factors in this type of model that have been for a long time have been used effectively as deterministic in terms of neural network systems definitely should be looked at more carefully. And also in comparison, what we did, as you see here, this short-term synaptic plasticity dynamics is also contributed quite substantially in the applications when you look at, for example, working memory in the brain case studies. And of course, this model, as you understand, could be extended quite substantially. This part of the project, of course, we've been influenced by many people. In this specific area, we kind of knew, but in terms of neurodegenerative diseases and modeling of those type, there are a few publications that we did in Frontiers and Computational Neuroscience last year and in scientific reports this year, including, for example, one of the extension of this type of models would be non-local type of models. As you see here, we focus on this multiplicative noise, which effectively noise which depends on the situations on the current system, but non-local models are extremely important in this area as well when you study brain functions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Roderick, for this interesting talk. Are there questions from the audience in presence or in virtual even? Something unclear? Perfect. I would have a question. What's about possible applications of your approach? I mean, this model is kind of theoretic, but what about the possible applications to utilize this kind of models?
Well, it's a completely theoretical model. As I mentioned, experimentalists basically looked at this model, and part of this model has been validated using experimental results. So it's not completely fair to say that this is purely theoretical, but I completely agree with you that in terms of if you're talking about like computational scale application, and for example, in the title you see neuromorphic computing, yes, this is definitely the very first step, because when we're talking about neuromorphic computing, we have to talk about large scale integration. Whereas what you've seen here is just, a kind of major emphasis on these random factors. So definitely a lot to extend. Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Roderick, again. And we'll have the next presentation from Alexander. It's about network size reduction, preserving optimal modularity and click partition. And this work is from Alexander Billy and Stanislav Sobolewski. So. Perfect. Then, Alexander, the stage is yours.
Hey, hello everyone. Thanks for coming to the talk. My name is Alexander Belli. I'm a PhD student at Modularity University in Czech Republic, and I'm presenting our joint work with my advisor Stanislav Sobolewski, which is called Network Size Reduction, Preserving Optimal Modularity and Click Partition. In our work, we study networks, and a lot of things could be modeled as networks. And one of the properties that real networks have is community structure, which is presence of densely connected clusters with very few connections between them. And while it could be easy to identify them when network is already plotted in some way, but algorithmically, it's an interesting and challenging problem how to do that, especially because the notion of community is vaguely defined. So there are possibilities to define it in different ways. And after you define, it could become quite challenging discrete optimization problem. So one of the most popular ways how to approach this problem is to define some kind of quality function that would tell you how good is your partition, and then you try to optimize this quality function by trying to find partitions. So one of the most famous and widely used quality functions is modularity, proposed by Neuron, and could be defined like that. You can see the formula. Basically, what it does, if you have a weighted directed graph, then for each pair of nodes I and j, you assign a score to this pair of nodes, which is based on the weight of the edge between them and degrees of the nodes, normalized degrees. And then the sum just sums those scores that are assigned to pairs of nodes that fall into the same cluster. Well, and then you can try to optimize this quality function to find communities and networks. There is quite well-known generalization of this problem. When you have a complete weighted graph, you can use those weights directly and do the same thing. Try to maximize sum of weights of the edges that fall into the same cluster. Basically, that could be viewed as the same formula if we change weights by assigning new weight to each pair of nodes with modularity score. Both problems was shown to be NP hard, so that becomes a quite challenging discrete optimization problem. And that's because that's NP hard, it's hard to solve this problem exactly, and there are mostly heuristics proposed to deal with larger networks. But it is still interesting question how to find the exact solution, and here I list several motivations why it could be interesting. Just to name a few, one could be to evaluate heuristics to see how good or how bad the solutions that heuristics finds and compare it with the exact solution. And just by itself, it's quite interesting and challenging problem. And with recent advances in optimization techniques and in optimization packages such as Cplex, larger and larger networks could be solved to the optimum. So the approach how to solve the problem, the most common is to formulate it as integer linear programming problem, when we define our basically Boolean variable for each edge, indicating that an edge falls into the cluster. That if the variable is 1, and if it's 0, that would mean that the edge connects vertices from different clusters. And constraints here just ensure transitivity. They're called triangle constraint, and they ensure that if vertices I and j fall into the same cluster and j and k fall into the same cluster, then obviously I and k should also fall. So those constraints ensure that. The problem is quite large. As you can see, like you have variables for each edge, for each pair of nodes, basically, and you have a cubical number of constraints. So besides that, it's a hard problem. Even the size of the problem grows pretty quickly with the size of the network. So just reducing this problem by few nodes could already give quite significant boosts, even in memory, but even larger improvements in time that it takes to solve this problem. So we propose a way how to reduce the size of the network. And there are two possibilities, at least we present here, and we know about two of them. One, imagine that two nodes I and j have very strong connection between them. That would mean that breaking this connection, moving those nodes into two different clusters, would break that edge, and it could be too much of a penalty. So if that inequality is satisfied, that basically it says that the weight of an edge connecting I and J is stronger than sum of all positive weights of other edges, and sum of absolute values of negative edges. So if our edge is stronger than that, then it means that in the final partition, those two nodes will definitely be in the same community, and then we can merge those two nodes, summing weights of edges. So that's one possibility that could allow us to merge nodes, reducing the size of the network. Another possibility is that nodes I and J could be just identically connected, and if they don't have a negative edge between them, that will also mean that they will fall into the same community in the final optimal partition. That could be seen quite easily. Basically, they are indistinguishable. So either if for some reason they are in different communities, then either moving I to the community of J or moving J to the community of I would only increase the final score by the value of the weight of edge connecting them, but it won't decrease. So those are two types of nodes that could be merged to reduce the network size. So that relates to two previous works. One of them is by Alex Arenas. He was considering just modularity maximization, and that's a picture from his paper. Basically, he showed that what he calls a hair basically is just one node connected with an edge to another node and having no other edges to the network. If node I doesn't have a loop edge, then it could be shown that modularity score WIK would satisfy that condition of being very strong connection. And second case that he considered, he calls triangular hair. Basically, that falls into our second category of edges of nodes that could be merged because I and J are identically connected. Like they are connected between themselves and they are connected with the node K, so they could be merged into one node H. There was another work recently, like 3 years ago, presented at the same conference. They generalized approach for Arenas, and they were considering larger cliques, and that's a plot from their paper. And what you can immediately notice coming from previous slide is that in the final partition, they actually merge the whole clique into the one node that connects that to the network. And we argue that it's not known a priori because those should be connected, those should be merged into the nodes that is connected to the rest of the network. But you can't a priori merge H and K. So our work covers all those cases, and the last plot, that's actually a counterexample to the previous work, where if you consider, like that's exact graphs that we consider, if you calculate modularity scores, optimal partition would be like that. So you can't merge this node into this community. That's not known a priori, and you should check the strength of that edge that connects it. Actually, in most cases, it will be very strong edge and you can connect, but it has to be checked. It doesn't follow from anything unless you check this condition. So we propose an algorithm how to reduce the size of the network. One consideration that you could notice that applying, like merging pairs, for example, could produce a new pair of identical nodes, and merging identical nodes could produce a new pair. So you should iteratively apply both algorithms, like both steps of merging, and the final complexity of those steps becomes O from O at n to the fourth power, which is large, but the time that it takes is negligible compared to the time that it takes to solve the problem exactly. Like this problem could be solved exactly probably for networks of sizes up to several hundred. So the time spent to reducing the size is negligible to time that it takes solver to solve this problem. So next we present for our results on two benchmarks. One we just took from the previous paper, and we applied our method to the same networks, partially to check that results that they presented were actually correct, but they were lucky that they didn't check this condition, but it still was optimal precision, and that we verified. But we also showed that our approach could merge more nodes, and it also reduces time further, times and memory complexity, of course. Here you can see that for some networks, it actually took us longer to solve because we present here times that they reported. We just couldn't reproduce those times, and in our case, time to solve original network was much larger. So it actually reduces the size and the time to solve. And another benchmark was quite famous. Sorry, that's the time. So, like in most cases, you can see that it reduces by half, sometimes even more. And the second benchmark was click partitioning problem. That's when you don't calculate modularity scores. You are just given a network with weights that indicate. In that case, it was similarity. It's a very famous benchmark in that problem. It was because those are published in an original paper by Gresham and Takabayashi. And it's still frequently used in literature. And we show that for some networks, if you apply our algorithm, it reduces the size of the network from almost 140 to 10 nodes, and the time that it takes becomes just negligible. So probably that benchmark becomes now super easy to solve and probably shouldn't be used anymore, at least if you apply the merging strategy in the first place before trying to solve the problem. So that concludes my talk. The main takeaway is that if you are trying to solve a click partitioning problem or modularity maximization problem exactly, first try to merge nodes that could be merged, that could reduce the time that it takes quite significantly. Another one that check all the necessary conditions, don't merge nodes that are not known a priori that could be merged. Thank you. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer.
Yeah, thanks, Alexander. Are there any questions in the audience or in the virtual space? Seems not the case. Oh, there's one. It's sure.
Thank you. Interesting work. I'm curious, what kind of contribution cost? Particularly when you deal with cubes.
Oh.
Let's say million number of nodes.
Well, yes, of course. Thank you. As I mentioned, if you want to solve problem exactly, it is still a hard problem. There is no one so far who came up with a solution to any of those problems. So it could be solved definitely for networks of up to 100 nodes, and several hundreds are solvable. In our case, there were a few networks with several hundred and even 1,000 nodes, but that the type of networks that could be reduced quite significantly, like from 1,000 we reduced to 300, and that could be solved in a couple of hours. So far, that's the limits, but that's an active research. Hopefully in the future. But yeah, of course, for billions, we don't even hope. Maybe until quantum computers arrive, but not before. Sure.
How the performance compares with are the stochastic techniques?
Oh, stochastic techniques would solve those networks in fractions of a second, and pretty often to optimality, but it's not guaranteed, and you don't know in advance if it's optimal or not. Well, also depend on the stochastic technique. So.
But here as well, it's not guaranteed.
Oh, that's guaranteed. That's optimal solution for that problem, and that's just linear programming problem. Well, it's integer that makes it complex, but well, what I assume simplex does is use branch and bound and then cut and plane. So, but yes, it guarantees it. Oh, sure. Yes, yeah, we are interested in exact solution, and we are solving this problem. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Just when we increase the number of nodes in the system, single criteria optimization problems becomes very rare. You have multiple criteria optimization. Therefore, probably the size is pretty good for the problems you may have in mind.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's possible to reduce not just to certain number. Because I mean, from let's say you have 1,000 original nodes, 100, 1,000, very positive. Have this level of size.
Yeah, sure. But this problem, like click partitioning problem, also arises in very applied topics, like assigning machines to the rooms, and they normally have problems of size few hundred. So, and they are really interested in exact solution. So there are some applications even to the exact solution, and so there is still contribution. But yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Another question.
Consider some other techniques, formulation.
Well, not here. Here we just use that formulation. Yes, we are aware of them. Thank you. We didn't use them in our benchmark, but we still reduce the network. So we definitely would say in the same way we reduce the size of quadratic problem. It was just easier to compare with previous works with that formulation. But yeah, like for modularity maximization, I think so far the best known technique to find the exact solution is by Aloise, and it does use quadratic formulation. So far it's unbeaten, but we are working on that.
Well done. Thank you again. And then we switch to the virtual space. Two more presentations. And the next one is from, oh, I hope I pronounced it right, Olya Suchenko, Yulia Avandyanova, Ivan Ostromov, Natalia Kuzmenko, Maxim Zyalensky, and Alexander Solmentchev. And I would hand over to who is presenting. I think Ola is presenting. Nice to have you here with us, and I would hand over to you, and hopefully screen is sharing. Yes, the topic is about algorithms for the design of robust stabilization systems, and the floor is yours.
My name is Olga Sushenko. I am from the National Aviation University located in Kiev, Ukraine. I am a representative of the Aerospace Control Systems Department, a department where we deal with design and control systems for aircraft and stabilization systems for aviation equipment. The very important trend of design and control and stabilization system is developing of algorithm of robust control and stabilization systems. The typicality of developing numerical algorithms for design of initially stabilized platforms is explained by the necessity to satisfy the high requirements for stabilization and tracking accuracy. Nowadays, there are two basic groups of the above-mentioned problems: precision stabilization of inertial sensors in gimbal inertial navigation systems, stabilization and tracking of measuring devices and equipment for different purposes, and combined stabilization of inertial sensors and measuring devices. To solve the problem of the inertial stabilization, it's necessary to take into consideration the Earth and moving vehicle motions, including the translational speed and translational and Coriolis accelerations. This requires corrections from the inertial navigation systems. Otherwise, the stabilization is considered to be inertial at some approximation. The block diagram of the initially stabilized platform is shown in this slide. The inertial navigation can be realized by means of both gimbal and strap-down systems. It should be noted that such factors as the progress of inertial sensors, such as laser, fiber optic, and MEMS gyroscopes, and computing techniques, have been led to the wide application of strap-down inertial navigation system. This trend was accelerated with the rise in the possibility to correct inertial navigation systems from GPS. Nowadays, high-precision gimbal inertial stabilization systems are mostly used in high-precision applications. On contrary, gimbal systems are important for the stabilization of measuring devices and equipment operated on moving vehicles. Strap-down systems are used in this area only in application with rigid restrictions on dimensions and low requirements to accuracy. For accuracy. Systems for control of initially stabilized platforms can be classified in different ways. One possible classification is shown in slide 5. It represents different types of initially stabilized platforms dependent on the presence of a platform or gimbal, application, stabilization plot, kinematical skip, type of a drive, and completeness. By application, gimbal and strap-down initially stabilized platforms are divided into aviation, marine, ground, and portable. By stabilization plant, initially stabilized platforms can be classified dependent on type of a payload. There are systems for equipment of different purposes, sensors of precision navigation systems, optic sensors, mobile antennas. Depending on the type of the kinematical diagram, systems can be one-axis, two-axis, three-axis, and multi-axis. Initially stabilized platforms can be divided also by the type of drive, dependent on the presence of the reducer. Features of initially stabilized platforms for equipment of different purpose depend on payload dimensions, which could vary in the wide range. This factor influence on design and dimensions of the platform and gimbals, and also on the realization of control loops, and of course on algorithms of design and control systems. The three-axis system ensures full stabilization of the platform. In this case, the platform dynamics is described by the Euler equations, which are represented in slide 6. If we have platform in the contour of our system, of course, it's necessary to take into consideration not only its dynamic, but its kinematic also. It's a very important point for such researches. And now you can see the way of representation of the kinematic of the initial platform. You can see here the standard sequence of turns of the platform in 3 directions. And of course, it's necessary to take into considerations all transformations of reference frames. There are 3 basic reference frames here, connected with platform and connected with internal and external frames of the gimbals. Now I will pass on to algorithm of designing initially stabilized platforms. The main feature of the system is operation in difficult conditions under action of disturbances. The best solution in this case is application of robust control. Robust parametrical optimization and robust structural synthesis are considered in this research. This direction are convenient for modernization and creation of new systems. You can see in this slide algorithm of or approach for algorithm of robust parametrical or optimization. The robust parametrical optimization requires using both nominal and parametrically disturbed models. Usage of parametrically disturbed models allows us to take into account uncertainties in the mathematical description. Block diagrams of deterministic and stochastic models are shown in slide 8. It's possible to increase the efficiency of the robust optimization using the mixed H2 H infinity approach. The combination of H2 and H infinity optimizations allows us to state the task of designing optimal stabilization system on the basis of quadratic criterion while maintaining its properties under the influence of disturbances. In this case, the optimal synthesis should be carried out using a combined optimization criterion, taking into account both the accuracy and the robustness of initially stabilized platform. Namely, such combined criterion is shown in slide 9. It's based on H2 norms, which influence on accuracy of the system, and H infinity norms, which influence on robustness of the system. Manner that it's impossible to achieve the optimal accuracy and robustness at the same time. We must use compromise between these parameters. Of course, the algorithm of this system designing is implemented in interactive mode. So researcher must estimate results during optimization procedure and change the degree of influence indices connected with accuracy and robustness respectively. And for this, we use the so-called weighting coefficients denoted as lambda in this formula. So researcher must change these weighting coefficients trying to achieve the desired result. For this, of course, it's necessary all-time analyze results of the optimization procedure. And also important component of this optimization criterion is PF, penalty function. Manner is that stabilization and control systems are characterized by such important parameter or such important property as stability. And penalty function helps us to avoid our designing in the region which is unstable for systems. So such optimization criterion allows us to define a vector of optimized parameters. When we consider parametrical optimization as a rule, this vector of optimized parameters represents coefficients of the controller. But of course, it's possible to take into consideration another parameters also. Now you can see the algorithm of the robust parametrical optimization. It's possible to divide it in 3 parts. The first part, all of these parts is illustrated by appropriate column. The first part is development of different models, stabilization plant, controller, disturbances, disturbed models, and so on. Because our criteria requires using very large quantity of models. Then the second column of this scheme shows the namely calculation procedure. As a rule, systems of such a type can be static or can have matrices with different values. It's necessary to carry out minimal realization and balanced realization in this case. Of course, we must also determine A2 and A infinity norms. And remember about penalty function. And lies, we use the namely optimization procedure based on genetic algorithm. It's also possible to use Neldemet algorithm. And after this, it's necessary to analyze results. If results allows to satisfy the requirements given to a system, we can believe that our procedure is ended. In another case, it's necessary to change weighting coefficients and repeat our calculation procedure. Now, we pass on to the robust structural optimization. This optimization allows us to design the controller. We must not know the structure of this controller. We will obtain it during this design procedure. And you can see here combined criterion for the algorithm of the structural robust synthesis. It's necessary to say that the modern approach to design initial stabilized platforms foresees usage of robust structural synthesis, and one of the widespread methods is the so-called H-infinity synthesis, which ensures design in conditions of uncertainty also. It's known that design of real system must satisfy some conflict purposes. Research of a compromise in this situation can be achieved by the
from here.
I'm sorry,
I can connect.
It's known that research of a compromise in this situation can be achieved by the usage functions of mixed sensitivity. Such criterion is called criterion based on mixed sensitivity. And we use here not weighting coefficients, but weighting transfer functions. And such an approach allows us to form desired properties of our control loops in the future. You can see 2 columns in this criterion too. The first columns correspond to the reference signal, and the second column corresponds to disturbance. That's why we called such systems, which can be designed using this criterion, 2-degree freedom. you can see further algorithm of structural.
Ola, just to
structural.
Ola, are you hearing me? Just to encourage you to wrap up a bit because we are running out of time. Okay.
Further, you can see results of this robust parametrical optimization and structural parametrical optimization. Pay your attention that dotted line correspond to change of parameters plus minus 50%. That it's impossible to achieve without using robust control. And conclusions. You can see clear conclusions in my slide about classification, represented algorithm of robust parametrical optimization. The features of the algorithm are described, the designing of robust structural system was considered, and the simulation results are represented. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Ola, for this interesting presentation. Are there questions from the audience in presence or on virtual? Seems not the case. Then I would thank you again and hope everything is fine and you're feeling well. Oh, there's a question.
It's not a technical question. I wonder, because she's from Kiev,
Yeah.
Ukraine, I would like to ask her if she's really in Kiev, Ukraine.
Okay. There was a, Ola, did you get the question? Are you in Kiev right now?
I don't understand. What is the question?
The question was just if you're staying in Kiev right now.
Yes,
Yes,
yes.
So how is the situation? We are feeling with you.
And I all time was in Kiev.
Oh, yes. So thanks for your presentation and Slava Ukraine.
Героям слава.
Okay, then we have the last presentation by Mikael, also from the virtual space, and he's presenting on interval approximation of the discrete Helmholtz propagator for the radio wave propagation along the Earth's surface. And I would hand over to Mikael, and stage is yours.
Okay, wait, I'm sharing my presentation. 1 minute.
Oh, that's fine. If you can do it in 50 minutes, we would be happy.
Okay, okay.
Fine. Perfect, we will see it.
Okay, hello dear colleagues. My name is Mikhail. I'm a senior researcher of St. Petersburg Federal Research Center of the Russian Academy of Science. The present research is devoted to developing of reliable and fast numerical algorithms for the long-range radio wave propagation problems. I will start with the mathematical problem statement. We are seeking the solution of the following two-dimensional Helmholtz equation with a tropospheric reflective index. The key feature of the specific problem is very large and physically unbounded computational domain. Following the well-studied methods, we consider the one-way Helmholtz equation defined as follows. Step-by-step solution can be written using the semi-discrete propagation operator. This is the schematic description of the considered problem. We have a source of radiation with known antenna pattern, irregular terrain profile with known dielectric properties of the ground, and an arbitrary tropospheric refractive index. Semi-discrete propagation operator can be approximately split into the refraction and diffraction operators. Action of refraction operator is calculated directly, thus it remains us to construct a numerical approximation of the diffraction operator. Express the second differential operator in terms of the second difference operator. Substitution gives us a fully discrete version of diffraction operator as a function of second difference operator. We are seeking the approximations of the fully discrete diffraction operator in the form of rational approximation. We define the operator function by the Cauchy's integral formula, where gamma encloses all the eigenvalues of the second difference operator. The solution of the eigenvalue problem is written as follows. Here, function u has the physical meaning of a plane wave with the specified vertical wave number. Thus, we have established the relationship between the argument of propagation operator, transversal grid step 1 delta z, and propagation angle theta. It is common to use Pade approximation at point 0 to calculate the coefficients of rational approximation. But the Pade approximation is local, so it gives excellent accuracy for small propagation angles, but its accuracy monotonically decreases with increasing propagation angle. However, in some cases, it is necessary to provide a certain accuracy for a pre-known range of propagation angles. For example, it is a propagation over irregular terrain where the maximum propagation angle can be estimated from the geometry of the problem. Instead of using a local approximation, in this paper, it is proposed to use a rational approximation on a segment. Rational approximation in Chebyshev roots is used as an approximation method in this research. The desired approximation interval is expressed as follows. This figure demonstrates the dependence of the approximation error of the value of xi. It is clearly seen that the Pade approximation gives excellent accuracy for small values of xi and small values of propagation angle, but the accuracy monotonically decreases with increasing xi. At the same time, the proposed rational interpolation calculated based on the maximum propagation angle 22 degrees gives a more uniform distribution of the error on the interval of interest. Now let's move on to the numerical examples. First, we consider a classical wedge diffraction problem with the following parameters. This figure demonstrates the dependence of absolute error of the discrete horizontal wave number on the propagation angle for finite difference for various finite difference approximations under consideration. It is clearly seen that the proposed method gives the best approximations on the considered interval. This figure depicts a two-dimensional distribution of the electromagnetic field amplitude computed by the proposed method. We verify the result, we compare the result with the split-step Fourier method. The two-dimensional distribution of error between the result obtained by the split-step Fourier method and the proposed method is depicted in this figure. Both methods use the same computational grid. It can be seen that both methods yield indistinguishable results for the desired range of propagation angles.
In particular, the proposed method with the selected computational parameters correctly calculate the field in the diffraction zone behind the obstacle. This figure depicts the spatial distribution of the absolute error between Pade approximation and split-step Fourier method, as it was predicted theoretically using discrete wave number. Pade approximation allows for smaller propagation angles than the rational interpolation method. In this example, both variants of Pade approximation yield a significant underestimation of the field in the diffraction zone behind the obstacle. Of course, reducing the size of the computational grid cells and increasing the approximation order allows one to increase the accuracy of the local Pade approximation. But at the same time, it will increase the computational costs. Now we consider propagation in a surface duct. The purpose of this example is to demonstrate the possibility of inhomogeneous tropospheric refraction index modeling within the proposed method. This figure depicts the spatial distribution of the field amplitude computed by the proposed method. It is clearly seen from the spatial distribution of the arrow that split-step Fourier method and the proposed method produced indistinguishable results in this particular case. The proposed method doesn't require any significant changes in the existing program implementations of the finite difference method because it differs from the existing Pade method only in coefficients. In addition, the proposed method inherits the advantages of the finite difference method associated with efficient modeling of transparent boundary condition. The proposed method is well suited for situations when large propagation angles are involved. It is the cases of irregular terrain modeling and propagation in dense urban environment. The source code of the proposed method is freely available in GitHub repository, and it is implemented in Python 3. Thank you for your attention.
Are there questions from the audience? Presence virtual? No? I would have a question. What's about evaluation of your proposed approach? What have you done there?
We compared with split-step Fourier method. It should be noted that split-step Fourier method have problems with transparent boundary condition modeling, and so we have developed a method which have excellent performance, and it can preserve precise modeling of transparent boundary.
Ah, okay, I see. Cool. So another question. Not the case. Then I would thank you again, Mika, and all the other speakers we had today. And I would then conclude. We had a nice session. We had interdisciplinary talks here, and I hope to see you again in the next sessions. That was the first one here of the general track, and in 5 minutes there will be the keynote of today in presence. I don't know the room actually. I would guess somewhere there. But to the virtual audience, thanks for being here. Thanks for being with us, and enjoy the conference as well. Thank you all.